and welcome to another episode of Spark Talk. February is Black History Month in the United States, and our comrades there have just published Black History and the Class Struggle, a historic journal of our group. Its lead article is titled Liberalism Destroyed the Black Struggle: How to Rebuild It. And this article goes through the history of the Black struggle in the 20th and 21st centuries in the United States and shows how and exactly why the liberals, time and time again, have sold out the Black masses, and why the Black movement, in order to go forward, must embrace communism. So, today, to take a deep dive into the Black struggle in America, I am joined by the editor of this fantastic new issue, Cairo Turner. Hello.
Hi, Mansa.
How are you?
I'm doing good. Excited to talk about this issue.
Likewise, me too. So this came out just, I think, a week ago. We have not received the physical copy yet, but I've just read the main article in the editorial, and I would like to say, I'd like to extend a huge congratulations to you and the team, because I think it's just very, very powerful stuff so far. So I can't wait to see the issue in print, in real life, and go through everything. But so far, a huge congratulations.
Thank you.
Cool. So I guess my first question right off the bat is this. Okay, yes, it's Black History Month and so on, but I think I'd like to start a bit broader. Can you give us a bit of a sense for the context in which this intervention comes? Like, your lead article is titled Liberalism Betrayed the Black Struggle: How to Rebuild It. That already says a lot about what you're trying to do. So I'd like you to maybe first explain to our listeners what exactly is it that the article, but also the publication in general, is seeking to do in this moment in American politics and society.
Yeah. So the reason we brought Black history and the class struggle back, and why it's really important right now, is that the thing you've heard us talking about forever is that we are in a new period. The election of Trump has marked the death of liberalism, and the right wing is on the rise. So what this means is that the oppressed are going to take it even harder than they've had to take it before, because the bourgeoisie no longer feels the need to pretend to care about their problems and whatever, and are going really on the offensive and just going to attack them. With this, and the rise of the right, the working class has come to see the problems of the oppressed as counterposed to theirs. And what we're trying to do is, really bridge this gap and actually show to the working class why they actually need to fight for Black liberation to better their own conditions, and to show to Black people, that the reason the Black struggle is in such a bad place right now, it's basically non-existent, is because of the betrayals of their liberal leadership, basically. That the reason there's no fight back against police brutality, there's no fight back to get any better conditions or anything, is because liberals have really driven the Black struggle into the ground. And we need to be able to rebuild it to defend ourselves right now, especially in this reactionary period. So what this issue is trying to do is kind of show exactly what I just said, and then counterpose communist politics to it, and show that being a revolutionary and having revolutionary politics is the most effective way to advance the Black struggle today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, you've said a couple of things there that, for us are kind of not controversial, but I'm wondering actually if you could give us a sense, the claim that the Black struggle is non-existent. How is that received in your experience when you argue that in the left or within Black circles? Would they find that controversial, or is that kind of accepted? And yeah.
Well, for Black people, I feel like that's pretty uncontroversial, because there's nothing happening. Like if you look back at like BLM, that was a huge thing where millions of people are on the streets. But today there's nothing. People are still getting killed by the police. There's barely any protests. If they are, they're tiny and isolated. Conditions for Black people are horrible. The ghettos haven't improved. There's very little upward mobility for most of the Black masses. A lot of people are chronically unemployed, just trying to make it by day to day. So I think to say that to Black people, the Black struggle really hasn't done anything or doesn't exist, is pretty uncontroversial. To the left, I think that at least I think it could be seen as uncontroversial, but there are some groups, that try to be like, we need a new BLM, we need this, we need to just go and do the same thing again. So maybe that'll be controversial to them who just want to do the same thing over and over again, which is kind of crazy to me. I just think to regular, real people, it's kind of uncontroversial.
Yeah, fair enough. Before we start diving into it, like, what counts? Like, what counts as the existing leadership of the Black movement? Is there such a thing? Like, who, like, okay, I totally see your point about, like, BLM, like, that was a thing, Like, is there anything that passes for, like, take a stand in defense of Black people? Like, is there something?
Barely, probably not, honestly. That's not to discount. There's probably little groups that do stuff, but like a giant, like a leader like that, no. And I also think that kind of shows like the impasse the Black struggle is in right now too. There's no leadership. There's no like figurehead that's like, I'm leading the thing. Like there's no MLK, and there hasn't been for decades at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, so let's maybe just get right into it. So the whole point of your article is, why doesn't that exist? Why is the movement not there? Why is there no figurehead, even a big old liberal one? You start your article by talking about the actual origins of Black oppression, like what is the material basis of it. So maybe it's useful to give our listeners a sense of that in order to really make sense of the following like political points.
Yeah. So I think it's really important to understand what is like the basis of Black oppression. Because if you ask people nowadays, they chalk it up to like just like racist ideas in white people's heads, and people are bad, and that's why Black people are oppressed. But the reality is that there's like a real material reason why Black people are oppressed in the United States, and it goes back to slavery. But how, what we call like this quote unquote Southern system of slavery became the basis of Black oppression is that, and also how race came into being, is because the colonialists needed to cultivate all the new land in the American colonies, and they needed to make massive profits. And the best way they thought they could do that was by bringing back chattel slavery. And the reason that like slaves were taken from Africa was because, they didn't know the land, they didn't have a shared language, it made it hard to escape, it made it hard to revolt. And also it was useful to take Africans and bring them here as slaves to cultivate a racial divide to stop the lower classes from rebelling. Because there were like white poor peasants and stuff like that here. And at certain points, the slaves and peasants would work together to try to bring down the ruling class. And the ruling class was scared of that. And they were like, this isn't going to happen. So Africans became Black, and racial inferiority was used to justify why they were slaves. And they created the system of white supremacy. And then if you were white, you were better than the Black slave, and the Black slave is the lowest of the low, and that's why they're slaves. And with that continued for a while until they became a budding capitalist class starting in the North. And then the slave system started really butting heads with the capitalist system. Like they had irreconcilable differences, these classes. And this brings us to the Civil War, which is really what the war was about, was which system is going to rule, capitalism or slavery. And with that, the Civil War happened with, the North wanting to get rid of slavery and the South wanting to keep it. And I think what's important to know about the Civil War was this was kind of the only time that Black people and the capitalist class actually shared an interest, and that was overthrowing the slaveocracy. So the Northern capitalists allied with the slaves and with abolitionists to take down the slaveocracy. With that and the defeat of slavery, this is when we get into like what is called Reconstruction. This ushered in like a period where Black people actually had some rights, in the South. And there was a real opportunity here to actually get rid of racial oppression altogether, that Black people no longer need to be oppressed by the color of skin. But what happened during Reconstruction was that the Northern capitalists betrayed the former slaves, because they were like, their measures were getting too radical, they were encroaching on their rights. And they no longer needed the slaves and the abolitionists as allies because they were consolidating power. So they would just push them to the side, forced them back into conditions like slavery. This is when Jim Crow started afterwards. And and also then began to perfect the system of racial oppression, because it also benefited them to have, Black people on the bottom and a racial divide going on in order to keep the working class divided.
Mhm.
So this is really where Black oppression comes from. It comes from like all the way from slavery, the Civil War, and the defeat of Reconstruction, which was all about, Black people fighting for their freedom and then ultimately being betrayed by the capitalist class. And then the oppression being used for the capitalists to build on top of, basically. The whole American capital system we see right now is based on Black oppression. And that's what really important to understand, that Black oppression comes from the material interests of whether it was the Southern planters or now the capitalist class. It's not just like bad ideas in white people's heads. Not just these people were like evil and racist, but Black oppression was needed to advance their interest. And why that's important to understand is that if you want to fight uh, Black oppression, you need to understand where it comes from in order to know who you need to fight.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
it's not just trying to get rid of bad ideas, but it's literally rooted in this entire system.
Yeah, fair enough. You need to know exactly what the source of the problem is in order to actually be able to deal with the problem. It's as
Yeah.
simple as that. I think here I'd like to just like briefly ask you to your article is called "Liberalism Betrayed the Black Struggle," and I think just at the outset I'd like to establish like what exactly is liberalism on the Black question, because like that word, what does that mean actually? Like who are we talking about? I guess the
Yeah.
liberals.
It takes, kind of a different shape depending what period you're in, but I think ultimately it's trying to fight Black oppression through allying with the liberal wing of the ruling class, uh, like sympathetic Democrats or whoever who say they'll help Black people, but at the end of the day, they defend the very system that Black oppression is a part of,
Right.
So if you're like clinging on to one side of the ruling class and hoping they'll fight Black oppression, that's a total dead end. That's suicidal. Like it's kind of has been the main problem of the Black liberation movement through decades. Has really been the question of leadership and how liberals have continuously tied the Black struggle back to the ruling class.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you start off with the civil rights movement. I mean, the civil rights movement is still upheld as kind of the pinnacle and the example, I think, in the mainstream as the model for what the Black movement needs to do, and also the sort of reasons for the advances and the rights that the Black population in the United States has achieved. So take us through what this period was. What was the civil rights movement, and what is our take as communists on it?
Yeah, the civil rights movement, came about in the mid 1950s and really blew up in the 1960s. And really what this movement was a fight against Jim Crow segregation. It started in the South, and it was led mainly by like the Black clergy and Black middle class. And this whole movement really took off after World War II, and the U.S. became the main superpower. Its only rival was the Soviet Union. And the reason this movement gained such momentum was because of like just America's hypocrisy, really. They were claiming that they were, the leaders of the free world. They're against prejudice, against racism, against all this bad stuff. But then in your own, it's not even backyard. It's literally their home. Like there's brutal Jim Crow oppression where Black people are literally forcibly segregated and into, their own space. There's no mixing. There's white only signs, colored signs. So how could
You
you
can't
sit there?
marry.
Yeah,
There's
you
no
can't marry.
interracial marriage.
Yeah, it's totally crazy. So then you're trying to come off as that you're like so against racism, so against oppression, and this is what's going on in your own country. And then Black soldiers were sent to fight and die in World War II to, under slogans of like against prejudice and, against oppression and everything, to come home and just have to deal with this shit is nuts.
Mm-hmm.
And also in that
You
contest.
you mentioned in your article that even the battalions of soldiers, they were themselves segregated as well. You had Black only units.
Yeah, there was still segregation in the army.
Yeah.
So like it's just kind of crazy to think about. And Yeah, so that was a part of the context. And also important part too was that um, so many like African nations were starting to gain independence and fighting against colonialism, and the Soviet Union and the U.S. were fighting over who was going to like gain influence. Was it going to be the communists or the capitalists? And Jim Crow was a real bad look to like a bunch of black nations who just gained independence, and they're like, "Look how you're treating your black people. Why should we listen to you?"
Hmm.
So Jim Crow was starting to be like a really like big thorn in the side of the U.S. Imperialists. And so that was one factor. And then the other factor of, just the black masses were like so tired of being like humiliated day in and day out. So all this really was bubbling over to cause like, a social explosion that turned into the civil rights movement.
Hmm. Yeah. I find it very useful in terms of how you start to explain the problems of the civil rights movement, in that you're actually looking at the international context, the role of the Soviet Union, the wave of decolonization, the impacts of World War II, etc., and how they actually were quite important in terms of giving this movement its particular dynamic and the pressure actually the U.S. was in. From my experience, a little I've read, like back in the day in university, on like the civil rights movement, MLK, anything like that, I feel like that's never really the starting point. So I just wanted to kind of take a point to talk about the method. And I wonder if you could explain to us, like, the way you're approaching the Black struggle here is not through the lens of like, here's this leader and here's this protest movement and here's this, in this sort of like framework of American politics, but really stepping way back to make sense of what was the sort of pressures and the needs of the American ruling class, and how that sort of shaped their policies or their, whatever. So what I feel like you're doing is like laying out a materialist way to approach the question, and not just the civil rights movement, but really any question, as well as opposed to like a liberal academic sort of method.
Yeah, that's correct. It's like we like to call it the Marxist method. But like, yeah, in order to actually understand, what was going on with the Black struggle or any struggle in general, you have to situate it in what was going on in the international context, and also what were the interests of the ruling class at the time, and what were the interests of the working class and the Black struggle at the time, and how they fit into each other. Because things don't just happen like randomly; they all fit into what is going on with the different classes in society. That's really how you need to analyze a movement. Because, in order to judge like the successes and limitations and whatever of the Black struggle, it needs to be situated in this context in order to make really sense of anything. If not, everything just gets kind of reduced to like bad ideas in people's heads.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's useful to understand the context in which the civil rights movement took place to really see the actual huge potential it had in order to really ramp through like a different, road rather than the one that, we saw play out in history. So, I mean, you end up talking about MLK Jr., obviously like a huge figurehead of the movement. And what is the main problem with MLK's strategy?
The main problem with MLK's strategy was that he was tying the fight against Jim Crow and integration to the ruling class at bottom. That was really what his main issue was. Because a lot of people talk about the civil rights movement now because it's obvious that to people that conditions for Black people aren't that great. So people are like, why did the civil rights movement not fix it? I thought this was the thing. And a lot of people say, like, right wing weirdos like say that like it's the Black family is the problem. Again, it's Black people have bad ideas and stuff, so that's why they couldn't advance. Some Black people that I talked to say that the problem with the civil rights movement was that we fought for integration, which is also not really the problem. But it goes back down to strategy. What was the strategy of this movement? And MLK's strategy was pacifist direct action, basically like going out, doing like peaceful demonstrations, and then racist white mobs would beat them up and cops would come and beat them up. And it was meant to like signal that, look, we're peacefully protesting, just trying to get our rights. And everyone is just so horrible and racist. And people would look at that and be like, oh, okay, these people aren't doing anything. People are horrible and racist. We need to stop racism. MLK's other thing too, though, was that he would be trying to work with sympathetic Democratic Party politicians like JFK to get civil rights acts passed, But what this really did was just tie the movement back to the very same people who were responsible for Black oppression, who had no interest in getting real integration at all. They could throw like a bone here and there, but to fundamentally change things for Black people, they had no interest in doing that at all. And I feel like the biggest example of this is, the March in Washington, which most people know is where MLK gave his like famous "I Have a Dream" speech and all that. But what was really going on during this march in the background was that they were just conceding and conceding and conceding to the Democrats at this time. Like they weren't allowed to say anything bad against them. That like John Lewis, who was in SNCC, his whole speech was censored in order to.
Sorry, SNCC is what exactly?
Student Nonviolent
Coordinating Committee.
Yeah. Yeah, he had a speech that was critical of the Democrats, and he was made to take it out. Because the whole thing couldn't disrupt the system. It needed to be compatible with it. It needed to show that, hey, these Democrats are on our side. They're with us. They'll help us get this bill passed and all. So really what this whole thing was holding the struggle back from the potential that it really had. Because the civil rights movement was huge. It was like shaking the world. Like it was like an international, like had international attention and everything. So what really needed to be done was the fight for Jim Crow needed to be fused with the fight against the whole capitalist system, basically, in order to get Black people out of the position they were in,
Yeah. I think that's precisely the point about just how refusing to break with a wing of the ruling class. That's the central point. But I have a couple of questions. One is like with the benefit of hindsight, I think it's important. It's far easier to be able to draw these lessons. But the civil rights movement was absolutely massive, right? Like MLK was loved by millions. So I'm wondering if like you could paint some of the contradictions of the movement. Obviously, he had huge support. His pacifist program had huge support. And I know like the church obviously played a huge role in terms of the Black community and so on. But like what were the different sort of wings of that movement? What were the sort of criticisms of MLK's strategy and how did that play out?
Yeah. Actually, during the movement, it's a little different than how MLK is viewed now as like the main, political figure. He was dominant at the time, but like there were people who like disagreed with him or had issues with what he was doing, especially among the youth. I could say like SNCC again was one of the youth that started to get in motion to go more left wing and wanting to do more than just like pacifist direct action or trying to make nice with the Democrats, but really to push to fix like what are the material conditions of Black people, like how are you actually going to fix this? And there was other like opposition too. I would say like Malcolm X is probably the biggest one to think of. That was like basically direct opposition to King. Like he was like, we need a revolution here, and you're not going to get that by just like being on your knees and turning the other cheek and trying to get the system to care about Black people. You're going to have to like overthrow these people. You're going to have to do that. And he's probably King's biggest critic. And when I was just talking about the March in Washington, he called it like the farce in Washington because he just saw it as like a pressure valve for Black people, to blow off some steam and nothing fundamentally changed. So yeah, there was some like more left-wing criticism of King in the movement. Yeah.
And what about like the socialist left in terms of like the main parties or groups at the time?
I think most of the socialist left, honestly, just tailed the civil rights movement. There's this group called the Socialist Workers Party, SWP, which our tendency came out of. During the civil rights movement, again, it was a lot of tailing, either the civil rights movement itself or the Black nationalists that came out of it. So there was really no one who was like fighting to like, we need to put this movement on a different course. There needs to be a break with these politics. Actually, there was someone fighting. It was us in the Socialist Workers Party that was fighting to do that. faction was called the Revolutionary Tendency. And we were trying to make the SWP actually intervene into the civil rights movement to fight to win a bunch of, militant Black youth to communism, to show them that this is the way to actually advance their struggles. But the Socialist Workers' Party didn't want to do that, and we got expelled in the process for fighting for that.
Yeah, okay. So the outcome of the civil rights movement, like, how would you characterize the outcome? Was it a victory, a defeat, somewhere in the middle?
I could say somewhere in the middle. Like it was a victory in the sense that it got rid of Jim Crow, and that's a big deal. Like I don't have to go through a Black only door right now, but it's mixed because while formal segregation no longer exists, like it's not legal segregation, but segregation still exists even if it's not on the books, and conditions for Black people really in mass did not change that much, And I feel like this could be easily seen, like, Jim Crow's in the South. There are Black people who lived like in the North and West and whatever. And so their lives weren't defined by, Jim Crow, but they still lived in brutally segregated ghettos, like plagued by cop violence and poverty. So in order to really meet the needs of the Black population, the struggle really needs to be broadened, and turned into a fight against, the ruling class's interests in order to get better jobs, housing, all the stuff that Black people need.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's fair. Let's come to the Black Panthers because, very, very different from MLK, armed to start with. And, they're much more attractive to Black militants, I think, even today. So, I mean, this represents a different wing of the struggle for Black rights and Black struggle in that period. As communists, what's our perspective and what's our take on the Black Panthers?
Yeah, I think that's right that the Panthers are super attractive. Like when people think of like Black militants, they think of the Panthers. And as a Marxist, our take on the Panthers is that, they were the best of a generation. They wanted to fight against, the liberal leadership of the civil rights movement. They wanted to take the Black struggle in a different direction. But I think the biggest, flaw in their strategy is really like, okay, well, how are you going to do this stuff? How are you going to fight for the ghetto masses? What's the social power that you look to? And, as Marxists, we look to the working class, not because we're just like, oh, the working class is so great or whatever, but because they have an objective, social power in society because of their position in society. And they have the force to actually, mobilize and fight back against Black oppression. But the Panthers really didn't look to them as the force, to fight back against Black oppression or to better conditions for the ghetto masses or anything. So this really left them kind of completely isolated, by themselves, trying to do, their armed patrols and all, to, defend them for trying to do that. But this just left them open for real, state repression, which I think most people know about the Panthers is, them being attacked by the state. So that's why I think it's really important. Like we say, we need a revolutionary working class strategy. This is kind of what we mean, because if you don't have that, then you end up totally isolated and just being gone after.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit more about the Panthers because they were quite heroic, and they were anti-imperialist, as you mentioned. They really connected their fight to that of the Viet Cong against the U.S. and so on. But I think too, like they did freak out like the American ruling class. You have this quote here about they feared the rise of a quote Black Messiah. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the sort of potential or the threat that the Panthers and their politics represented for the ruling class. Even though it's not like proletarian centered and so on, it was attractive, and even the ruling class saw that and its potential to be able to give a voice to the anger in the ghettos and so on.
Yeah. So like the Panthers were inspired to like form their group after like a bunch of ghetto uprisings that happened in the mid to late 1960s. Because really what this was a reaction to like the civil rights movement not being able to meet the needs of the ghettos, basically. And there was like all these ghetto uprisings and explosions that were happening, particularly being triggered by cop brutality and their neighborhoods just being harassed and people being gunned down all the time. And what was really attractive to the Panthers, because they wanted a different solution, outside of like liberal boundaries. They wanted to fight for Black people in the ghettos, and they wanted to stop police brutality and do all this. And they were pretty militant. Like they were like following the cops around with guns and trying to protect people, from the police. And they had a lot of really great left-sounding rhetoric about taking down the system. They knew Black oppression was inherent to this capitalist system. They wanted to get rid of it, and they said the only way that Black people will be liberated is when we get rid of the system, which is all true. So that's what made them like very attractive. They really were like a voice of the ghettos and of Black people, and that was really scary to the government at the time, because they knew if Black people were able to like get organized and fight back, that would be a real problem. Yeah. That would be a real problem for the American ruling class. That would be like a revolutionary situation. That would be crazy. So they like just went after the Panthers so hard. Like the quote you were saying, like they can't be a Black messiah. And the quote that's like, Black people need to come to understand that if they succumb to revolutionary politics, they'll be a dead revolutionary, that they cannot be Black revolutionaries. So that's why, the state went after the Panthers so hard, because they could not chance this. They could not chance their ideas, growing more broadly, and actually people following them and whatnot. Yeah, so it really scared the hell out of the capitalist state. Because like I was saying in the beginning, the capitalists need Black oppression to maintain their rule. So if a bunch of Black people start rising up against them, then they know it's over for them.
Yeah. You note that the state assassinated at least 28 Panthers, including 17-year-old Bobby Hutton and Fred Hampton, who was murdered as he slept next to his pregnant fiancée. Yeah, for sure. But then I'd never thought about the Panthers in this way, in terms of how you lay out that despite being so heroic, so militant, and actually despite being not liberals, because we're saying, okay, the liberals betrayed the Black struggle, but the Panthers, especially in their early years, were not liberals, right? Like they're trying to bring down, they're trying to say like, we don't need the system, the system's got to go. Yeah. Despite, ticking all those boxes, their problem is that they were isolated. And I think this again goes back to your point about looking to the working class, which it seems has been like also a historic problem of the Black movement in the United States. Yeah. It's the question of like, strategy. How are you actually going to take down the system? Is it going to be, the handful of Black people with guns, or is it going to be mobilizing the American working class, which would probably also have guns, to take down this system? It's a kind of a numbers question. Black people are a small part of the U.S. I think right now we're 13%. And the working class has way more numbers and, and an interest in actually overthrowing the ruling class as well. You need these people on your side, not because you need to like love the white people in the working class or whatever, but because you need them. They're like a tool to be able to get rid of the system, and not looking to them leaves you just completely especially if you're a Black militant. There's nothing more than the government wants for you to be totally isolated so they can just get rid of you, And that has been a historic problem with the working class in the United States, not, taking up the fight for Black liberation. So that's why like this whole question of Black militants needing to turn to the working class is actually, it's a key question, but it's also a hard one to sell, because, a lot of the working class here is white. And there's a lot of distrust from Black people to white people. And, a lot of the consciousness, it could be kind of backward or whatever. So you don't want, you're like, there's a lot of Black people I talk to, they're like, why would I want to go in there and talk to these people? And, Yeah. I mean, it's understandable. I mean, look, who did the working class vote for in huge numbers? Trump, right? So it's totally understandable that Black people aren't just like jumping on the chance to go talk to the white workers who they should talk to. But, we'll come to this later in terms of like why there is a need for this. And I appreciate that. Like, I think a constant thread so far in our discussion has been like really rooting in terms of like the shared interests, as opposed to this sort of more moralizing politics of like, who's your ally and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So to come back to the Panthers, so they had kind of a, really glorious start, but then it didn't go down so well. A lot of them were assassinated. But I think politically also, they ended up moving quite a ways away from their early perspective. I wonder if you could take us through what exactly happened and how that's really rooted in their politics.
Yeah. So as the years went by and it got closer to the 70s, the Panthers started to see, fractures and decline with that. And I think it's important to talk about like the political issues that happened, because a lot of people think that the only reason the Panthers, died out was because they were all killed, which, they were gone after. There were political reasons that led to their deterioration. I think the first one is, the lack of working class perspective leads you to go in several different directions, if you're not anchored in that perspective. The first one was that there became a split in the group, two major tendencies. One was more of a liberal wing, which Huey Newton became a part of, and the other one was more of an adventurist wing, which was led by Eldridge Cleaver. And I guess the context of why this split happened, you also have to look at what was going on in the world as well. Because, like we were saying, the Panthers' whole thing in the beginning, they're very militant, very against the system, really was showing why the system needed to be overthrown. They were anti-imperialist. They were against the war in Vietnam. But as the world began to change a little bit, and affirmative action programs started happening more, getting more opportunities to Black people. There were more Black mayors and other representatives popping up all across the country. And in regards to the Vietnam War, as the U.S. became really starting to lose that war, they started to pull back. And with these things happening, a lot of the Panthers' supporters and allies and whatnot started to be less inclined to look to them, because they were like, well, why do we need to overthrow the system if this current system is doing this? They're giving Black people, access to different stuff, and the war in Vietnam looks like it's going to end. So let's just keep the system. The system's doing its job. It's working. And this left the Panthers even more isolated than they were before. And the Newton wing that I was talking about, who became more liberal, the reason they became more liberal is because they started chasing the liberals who were leaving them, and they wanted to appease them to keep them to stay. So they started, dropping the armed patrols and saying that they needed to overthrow the system, and kind of just making them more palatable to liberal appetites, basically, so they'll stick with them. Well, the other wing saw this, and in reaction to this basically liberal liquidationist approach, was like, no, we need to overthrow the system right now. We need to do this right now. And basically started doing a lot of adventurous stuff, which led to a bunch of them being dead or in jail. Another point on the Newton wing is that I think the biggest example of them appealing to liberals is when they ran Bobby Seale for mayor of Oakland as a Democrat, and basically shut down all their Panther offices and told everyone to come to Oakland to support the campaign. I feel like that's the most evident thing. But, these two wings, it's kind of just like a sad example of what happens when your orientation is not, revolutionary working class politics. It kind of leaves you like nowhere else to go except like deterioration and down these different paths of either chasing liberals or being adventurous. And as you can see, like both of these things didn't end up liberating Black people.
Yeah, for sure. I'm trying to think of a potential listener, a young Black militant or a young Black leftist or whatever, listening to this. And I'm just started thinking, like, I appreciate the point you just made, that the problem is on both sides. Like, it's that the working class movement has never historically had a perspective to champion the Black struggle, and then that just fuels a lot of distrust amongst the Black population. Like, well, why am I looking to those guys? They're not doing anything for me, So it's just this like constant sort of division that you see, which, if today we look at the United States, it's getting worse and worse. So within that, I'm just trying to think, like, it's easy for us to draw lessons like several decades on, but the perspective of like being centered on the working class, I agree, is crucial.
Mm-hmm.
And in your article, you talk about drum, which is a small but like quite an interesting example of, again, like, I think how huge the obstacles are to doing what we're trying to say needs to be done, So drum was the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement. So these are auto workers in, what is it, Michigan? Detroit. Yeah, Detroit Auto, which is like, Detroit back in the day was like massive in terms of its strength and potential for really like making it hurt for the American ruling class. I wonder if you want to take us through a little bit of drum and like what its contradiction was, because they were trying to do the right thing, but then again they stumble even from within the working class. These are auto workers trying to do working class revolutionary politics, but even then you kind of stumble again. You hit up against the same sort of problem of like building that unity.
Yeah, so drum was part of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, which wanted to kind of be an alternative to the Panthers, like organizing like the Brothers of the Block or whatever. But like they knew the working class had power, and they knew if they could organize it, they could fight back against racist attacks, on the job and off the job and in the country, and really fight for Black liberation, which is exactly what we want. That is the perspective we want. But the problem comes in when it's okay, you're looking to the working class, but the problem with Drum and the League for Black Workers is that they're only looking to a portion of the working class, which is the Black working class, and kind of excluded other white workers that worked in the same factories, and didn't look to mobilize them in defense of Black rights, because they thought they couldn't, that what interest do these white workers have in fighting with me? And I don't want to fight for them. There's racism on the job. I'm sure there's racist white workers who are there, and that really like makes you not want to work with these people, and you can see them as the problem. But again, if you understand the source of Black oppression is it comes from the capitalist ruling class, not bad ideas in white people's heads, then you understand that you have to mobilize, the force, the working class, that can actually defeat these people. And that includes white workers. If you don't, then you're kind of setting yourself up for failure a bit, because like an example I used in the article was like, okay, you're trying to shut down a factory, you're trying to go on strike or whatever. If half the factory stays inside, then what are you doing? It's not really making a dent, it's not really making the impact you want. But if you organize everyone to actually go out, then that can actually cause an issue for the bosses, So again, it's not about like just having to like, love every white person or whatever, or you have to understand it goes back to strategy and what you're trying to accomplish here. And it doesn't mean, 'cause I think a lot of Black people think it means, dropping, the question of Black liberation or the quote unquote divisive questions to appeal like to the lowest common denominator. But no, it's about showing to these workers why it's actually their interest to fight for Black rights and fight to defend Black people. Why that's also in their interest as well.
Yeah. I think actually this example, I mean, I think the whole article really shows how the racial divisions really work to the benefit of the ruling class and keeping everybody down, not united against capitalist class rule. But I think the example of drum, for me particularly, just on a personal level, really hit home. Like, here are militant, revolutionary minded workers. But then despite all that, there's a certain liberalism in their outlook, which is, there's the racist bad ideas, instead of like pitching the fight on the basis of what you just laid out in terms of like, this is, to fight for Black liberation is actually in the interest of the white working class too. Okay. Right. So I guess to step back and take stock of what we've talked about so far. So you had the heyday of the civil rights movement, kind of ended not with a defeat, but not with a huge victory as well. Somewhere in the middle, legal segregation was over. There was some gains, but like informal segregation remained. Even the more militant wings of the Black movement, the Panthers, Drum, etc., had their own problems. And how do we draw lessons of like the 60s and the 70s? I guess, how would you sum up this period?
I think it was a period of like radicalization, wanting to fight the system, especially in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. They became more radicals who saw like how liberal integration was not working for them, and they need to be something different. But despite, how radical, a lot of them were, without, a working class perspective or a revolutionary into working class perspective, I should say, it's kind of just not going to go anywhere. You're not going to be able to accomplish what you're looking for. Back to the example of drum, like we were saying, they were in the working class. It's great. They wanted to mobilize the working class. But again, it's not like an integrated fight, It's really just weakening your cause, You're kind of like chopping off yourself at the leg here by not mobilizing the entire working class to be behind you.
Yeah. Now, you've mentioned this word a couple of times, revolutionary integrationism. I mean, this is a word that we, perspective, really, that we uphold for like Black liberation in the United States. And I wonder if you can briefly lay out what that is.
Well, I feel like to put it most simply, fusing the Black struggle with that of the working class, fusing the Black struggle with with socialism, basically.
Yeah.
So it's like in order to get real integration or to really integrate Black people into society and get everything that Black people need, you're going to have to go against the interests of the capitalist class. That's just the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
In order to do that, you have to tie the fight for Black liberation to the fight of the emancipation of the working class. So I think that simply put, that's really what it means. In order to get anything, it needs to be a revolutionary working class fight.
Yeah, I think that's nicely put. In particular, why I wanted to get you to elaborate on that a little bit is, especially going into the next sort of period where we see that the US imperialist ruling class is really starting to tighten the screws and amp up the attacks. What you see playing out is workers being pitted against each other, along race and other lines. And they start to see that, okay, well, they're what you call like sharing the crumbs, as opposed to increasing the pool of like resources, increasing the amount of jobs, wages, everything, housing, schooling, etc. Any gains for the Black population come to be seen as like gains that were had at the expense of the white population. So you start to see like real toxic mess that starts to actually worsen I don't know if worsen, but that's this dynamic play out a lot more as a sort of period of neoliberalism and so on starts to come to the fore, as well as affirmative action, I think, because that's when you start to see that this open resentment that, Black people, they're getting the jobs just because they're Black, and that's coming at the expense of me and mine, and so on. So let's transition to Reagan reaction. That's the next period.
Yeah. So when Reagan was, coming into power in the early 80s, the changing international context really was that American imperialism was declining. And it was getting hit with crisis after crisis. Like the American century that everyone said was happening after World War II seemed like almost people thought it was going to be over in the 70s because there was a major recession, several oil crises, like there was crisis after crisis for the American economy. And at the same time, other countries who were like crushed during World War II were rebuilding and starting to be real competitors now for the US, like Germany and Japan and whatever. And the US felt itself going down a bit. And in the US, for the working class, things were getting terrible because there was economic misery, going on. And this created a real backlash to the civil rights movement, basically, and certain gains that Black people were able to achieve. Like you're saying, affirmative action was one of them, because in this really bad period, Black people being seen as getting something can only be seen as to be taken away from white people, and it was being seen by white people as like, why are these people just getting more and more while I'm suffering and I'm not getting anything. Well, also in reality, the masses of Black people were still suffering. It wasn't like it was some like great things happening. but this was really causing a lot of tension and division. Another thing that caused a lot of tension was busing, which was, a plan to try to integrate the schools by sending white kids to black schools and black kids to white schools to try to integrate the schools. But this really caused a lot of backlash because, black kids weren't being sent to like rich white schools and best neighborhoods. They were being sent to like poor working class schools, barely had any resources. And now we're like putting more kids in there to a place that has very little. And then white kids are being shipped off to like ghetto schools that barely had anything. So it's really upset parents and made it seem like, okay, black people are the cause of our problems. So when Reagan came around, he really played into this discontent. He really like won like a substantial white working class voter base that put him in office. The things he were campaigning on was like, oh, you hate busing, I'll get rid of busing. I'll get rid of affirmative action. I'll get rid of all this stuff the black people got, and I'll help you. So he's really able to play into this racial divide and in the fears and anxieties that white people had. And another reason why Reagan got into office was to help the ruling class out of its crisis that was happening in the 70s, He came in with a whole new ideology, I guess I would say, and, a whole new economic plan to save the U.S. Kind of how we see Trump doing right now. We say the death of liberalism, and Trump ushered in this new thing. When Reagan came in the 80s, he was bussing up the whole New Deal order that was established back in the 30s and bringing about neoliberalism. So that was really the context around Reagan's election and coming to power, and what he was trying to do and what the ruling class was trying to accomplish as well.
And in this context of the Reagan reaction, as you called it, what was the state of the Black movement?
Pretty bad. The Black movement and all like the radicalism of the 60s really died of the defeated Panthers. Since then, there hasn't been like much of anything in the Black movement, honestly, for a while. Like in the 80s, it was pretty bad. Like, you get the civil rights movement's over, the Black radicalism era is over. Black people are facing a massive backlash, and it's kind of just a lot of misery, honestly. Like, there's no one who's really taking up the fight against Black oppression,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One point you make, in general, I think what this publication makes, Black History and the Class Struggle, is that labor and Black rights either go forward together or fall back separately.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think what is far more known about Reagan is the attacks in the working class and the smashing of the labor movement as well. And how, you see all of a sudden you're in the period like following the civil rights movement where things are at an ebb.
Mm-hmm.
And the Black movement is kind of, defeated. But so is the working class movement. Reagan came in and really smashed the working class through PATCO, and that was a huge watershed. And you argue in your article that this is a blow that the labor movement has not recovered from to this day. So I wondered if you wanted to talk about the movement, like the two movements going up and down together, and what that means.
Yeah, I feel like the 80s is like a perfect example to show this because, Reagan was attacking both groups, Black people and labor. You're talking, PATCO was like defining moment for the labor movement, where they were completely smashed.
Yeah.
And
so this was a strike by air traffic controllers, who went on strike, and Reagan, he declared the strike illegal, and he fired more than 11,000 workers in one go.
Yeah.
Like that is quite a sign. Like, we don't care. That's 11,000 workers just in a go, and that's quite something. And the unions at the time, the union bureaucrats especially, they refused to fight this. I guess they just kind of swallowed it, and they're like, okay, well, all right, what's next, But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like, that was a huge defeat, and the union leaders refused to fight back. They didn't, shut down the airports. They just kind of took it and let it be that. And with the Black struggle, like, Reagan was like going after Black people hard. This is when mass incarceration started, This is when he was like going after welfare queens and whatnot, and police brutality was up, and the war on drugs was going on. So Black people were being just sent in mass to prisons and being harassed by the police and all this stuff. So I feel like it's pretty clear that um, the fight against Black oppression and the labor movement's fight needed to be fused. These struggles needed to be together in order to defend themselves from Reagan's offensive. But the reason this didn't happen is, again, it goes back to the question of leadership. If the union leaders of at the time had no intention of fighting for Black rights, and especially trying to organize more Black people and bring in Black people to the unions. Like, a lot of Black people either couldn't get into the unions, or if they were in the lowest paid jobs, at the very bottom tier stuff.
Tell us a little bit more about that, like what you just said about how a lot of Black workers couldn't get into the unions, and actually how this plays out within the union movement itself, because we're talking about the working class, but like, even if like there's a whole lot of problems in there.
Yeah, like for a long time, like for decades since the civil rights movement or whatever. I'm not trying to say it was whites only, but there wasn't like a hand extended to like, let's organize all these Black people in the unions. Especially like when I think about the 80s or post civil rights, there was a big fight from Black activists to try to push for Black people to get into the unions, or if they are in the unions, to get higher up, get better wages, get better stuff. But the way they were doing that was by trying to either sue the union or go after seniority, because they saw seniority as like a barrier to Black people being to climb the ladder, and the union saw it as Black people as attacking the unions, and so like it was never posed as these two groups have the same interest to fight against like this crazy assault that is going on. And this has been like a thing for a while, but in the 1930s, the CIO, before they came fused with the AFL, they actually were trying to fight for Black people to be organized and trying to make a case that labor's cause is the same as the Black cause, and it's these struggles go together. But there was a purge of communists from the unions, because a big reason why that was being pushed, because there's communists in the unions and they saw the two struggles together. But once the communists are purged and the CIO fused with the AFL, this whole perspective was gone. It was just, it was like, oh, it's Black oppression is just some bad ideas and whatnot, and just to get rid of the bad ideas. And you don't need to, labor doesn't need to actually have a fight for Black people. They just, have nice ideas and it'll be fine. So that's when the real kind of change occurred. And that's kind of been the problem going on today with the labor movement, where it does not see the need to take up the fight against Black oppression, and this really goes back again to the union leadership, and what they see their task as. It's not that. It's to, tries to not cause too much trouble for the capitalists,
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the same point about being in a block with a wing of the ruling class, and I think the tops of the American labor movement are totally tight with one or the other party of American imperialism. So, yeah. Look, so we're an hour into our discussion, and we've only just, we're at the doorstep of the 90s, but I want to take a pause there because so far in our discussion, the Soviet Union has played a big role. I mean, we've not really talked about it, but that did condition a lot of the pressures on both the black movement, but also on the ruling class as well. But before we get to the 90s and the period after the Soviet Union is no more, I wondered if you wanted to end this part of our discussion by talking a little bit about the work of our own organization, because you talk about here that, in the 80s, you have a lot more divisions, you have open racist reaction, and you actually have, the sort of resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan as well. And it's within this context that we in the SL actually led some actions. And I just wondered if you wanted to give a bit of a slice of history.
In the 1980s, like we talked about, it was a very reactionary period. Klan was back in action, basically. And we had several demonstrations during this period to stop them. One of them was in San Francisco when the Klan was trying to, like, I think it was Nazis, not specifically the Klan, was trying to celebrate Hitler's birthday. And in 1982, the Klan was trying to march, against illegal immigrants. And 5,000 union members, Black youth and anti-racist militants came in to stop them. Those are some of the examples that I know about, which is kind of what we need. It's a small example of the kind of integrated, struggle we need to show Black people and the oppressed that actually white people can, take up this fight and must take up this fight, and all like reactionary shit like this needs to be smashed.
All right. So I think now is a good time to end this part of our discussion. Because as I said, I think following the collapse of the Soviet Union, this whole thing gets a different sort of coloration in terms of how the imperialists are parading around the world, with all kinds of liberal and progressive values, and what that does to the Black movement. So call it an end there, and we will pick this up in part 2.
Okay,
cool. All right.
Well, I ain't got no smoke, at least not with you. And I don't know if you don't know, but there are just a few of oligarchs and capitalists profiting massive profits, holding us down in lockstep. And your vote, it ain't gonna stop